My name is James Pomeroy, and I've worked in safety for over 30 years. I've worked in a variety of sectors, particularly in high hazard sectors, things like aviation, maritime, oil and gas. And I've also been privileged to work internationally. And that's given me a kind of a very unique perspective that tends to look at countries and different approaches to safety in a different way. The benefit of also working in different sectors means that you can start to look at how different industries and sector groups view safety, whether that's related to the protection of workers or whether that's how they protect their products or processes. So that's a bit about me. What I now do is I lead the safety and quality team within Arup, which is a consulting services in the built environment. In my spare time, I'm also a PhD researcher, and I focus on understanding the meaning of safety information. So a bit about me, 30 years plus experience, and I'm really keen to be involved in safety on the edge, and particularly kind of sharing some of the ideas about what my research is telling us.
Great. So a lot of folks in safety are, I'll say, our vintage, didn't necessarily start out in safety. How did your safety journey begin?
That's a really interesting question. So I started in safety as an engineer. I was working in a hospital healthcare environment, and actually it's coming out a pretty early on career after completing an apprenticeship and continuing my studies. During that period of about 2-3 years, the hospital unfortunately suffered a series of asbestosis deaths. So seeing those around me actually kind of really suffer the pains of asbestosis and unfortunately ultimately dying from it. And mesothelioma actually really made an impact on me. And it kind of created a bit of a career shift for me, for no longer being involved in engineering and actually starting to get involved in this thing called safety. And at the time, it was quite nascent. It wasn't really the thing that it is now. And people did say to me, why are you specializing in this? So I don't know whether it is necessarily something that was kind of set out, but I've enjoyed being in it. It's a particular area that you can have a real impact and the diversity of areas. But I never forget why I originally came into safety and that kind of human impact, and particularly when we get it wrong, whether it's related to incidents or in the case of the 3 individuals over a relatively short space of time, an exposure that they experienced early on in their career that unfortunately they pay for the price some 30-40 years later.
Yeah, wow. That's definitely an impactful story and definitely understand the inspiration behind your career shift. So with the upcoming Safety on the Edge conference that's scheduled for March 26th, 27th of 2025, Corey Pitzer and Malcolm Staves are trying to do something a little bit different than maybe some of the traditional conferences. So maybe you could talk a little bit about why you're eager to participate in the inaugural Safety on the Edge event.
Yeah, I mean, I was privileged to be asked by Corey and Malk to participate. Safety can be quite divisive. It can be quite tribal, where you get individuals with particular viewpoints that are kind of putting forward a view on how they think safety should be approached. One of the things that really impressed me with what the guys were trying to do was it was taking different views. It was taking people who really understood actually safety as a kind of its deep roots in terms of theory. People like JC, I would say, coming in, JC Lecrals, from looking at a kind of traditional theoretical background to practitioner base. There's a lot of people from very different perspectives and different views. And I think actually getting those views out there and recognizing that there isn't a single view, a single approach to safety, I think is super interesting. So I'd say the diversity is one thing. I think the breadth of actually the topics that they're covering is interesting also. And the idea of actually accepting that there can be different ways of doing it, and it doesn't mean any's right or wrong, but also the idea about actually kind of testing some of these new ideas and these new theories And I don't mean in an adversarial way, I mean actually from a perspective of curiosity about what works and why it works. Because safety kind of moves in particular fads and fashions, but it's beyond that. It's actually how do we start to learn from what is actually working, why it's working, and why does it work in a particular sector? Because I think going back to this idea that there isn't one approach to safety, we often forget context.
Right.
And when you look at the range of people who are actually involved in this, actually, I think that's really interesting also, the different sectors that come in. Because going back to something I said a moment ago about my early career and having worked in different sectors, probably the biggest thing that I take is actually why something works in aviation or in oil and gas and may work in the sector that I'm in, but equally may not. And I think context is missing, and you get a lot of context from the range of discussions and speakers, and particularly attendees that they've got involved.
Yeah, that's a great, definitely a great point. So I'm excited to hear about what you're going to be speaking about at the conference and digging into that a little deeper.
Yeah. So for my PhD research, I study something which sounds really strange and a bit abstract, something called semiotics. And semiotics is about the kind of how we make meaning from signs. So, many of us are viewing this video now, and you're taking information from what I'm saying, from the backdrop, from my body language, and none of this actually we really take adequate account of within safety. So that's the area of my study, looking at the signs and the meaning making, not necessarily from procedures, but actually from how we make information from the signs around us. And what I'll be talking about is one particular area field of my study, and that's about language. We use a lot of words in safety. In fact, most of the way we make meaning in safety is through the articulation of speech and our interpretation of written text. That's how we communicate a lot. But we often don't take account that this is a sign-making process. So a certain word that I could use gives you certain information, but it may preclude information from you. And what I'm going to be talking about is something called metaphor. And there's a kind of idea that actually a lot of what we use within safety is metaphorical. So whether we think about concepts like work as imagined, work as done, we kind of take that for granted now, but actually it's a metaphor. And that metaphor helps us think differently about the nature of procedures and whether they're of use or actually whether they're figures of our imagination and have no sense of reality. But we could take another one. We could take something like drift. Drift is a really popular concept in safety, the idea that over time, what you think is happening in a procedure, gradually there is this drift. Now, there's a metaphor that actually creates an idea in our mind. And even down to some of the great seminal thinkers in safety, we've got ideas about, let's think about how accidents incubate. So the moment I say the word incubate, I've used a metaphor, I've created an idea in your mind that this is like this pathogen that's breeding. Now, the moment I say these trigger words like resilience or pathogen, or actually even human error, we don't often think that these are metaphorical. But once we step back and you say, actually, yeah, that's interesting, they're metaphors, then you start to think, well, how's the metaphor shaping how we think about a problem? And this has been going on in safety for decades. Some of the earliest theories in safety called an accident proneness theory, that you or I were more prone to accidents. Again, we're talking in metaphors. So metaphors since the earliest time, when we've had theories and ideas, have shaped how we've thought about safety. They've made a bridge from one idea, which is quite abstract about safety, through to something which is quite concrete, like a row of dominoes that suddenly collapses. But we don't think we're thinking metaphorically. So actually what I'm aiming to do is to show that the way that we present safety, the way that we frame it through metaphors like accident proneness or a domino theory, or even how we talk about accidents, has a real impact, not only in terms of how we communicate our safety ideas or how disasters or accidents happen, but also how we take meaning from that. And there's a great phrase in the kind of study of metaphor that if you want to change your idea or change your thinking, change your metaphor. And we've seen that a lot because in the last kind of 10 years, we've had this phrase come through like workers imagine, workers done. And the moment you introduce that metaphor, now we can't help but think there's a difference. There's the work as it's created, and there's the procedures. We probably didn't think like that before, but now we do, and it's all thanks to the introduction of a new metaphor. So what I'll be talking about is the role of metaphor, how it helps us communicate, but also how it actually shapes, but may also constrain our thinking. And that's the gist of what I'll be talking about.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, and um, you mentioned drift, and I think that like resilience again is a metaphor that people have been talking a lot about as of late. But is it new or just a new way to present a previously existing behavior scenario within an organization or individual?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes these metaphors are created. So from the Piper Alpha incident, um, we learned the story of two survivors of Piper Alpha, one of whom jumped in to the North Sea in the north of Scotland, and they survived. And that created a metaphor. One person who was reading about the disaster, they created a metaphor called the burning platform. Now, chief executives and business leaders love to use that metaphor because they can actually create a sense of urgency. So sometimes metaphors are created from safety stories. Other times they're a kind of a scholar who actually creates one. Barry Turner famously created the idea of man-made disaster. The moment you say it's man-made, it's not natural, it's curated. And then you talk about actually, what that meant in the sense of that disaster. Nancy Leveson has used metaphors quite a bit. So sometimes they are created, other times they come into our vocabulary. Workers imagine, workers done is one that has kind of, excuse the metaphor, but has permeated through our thinking, and it's helped us reshape. And sometimes they are kind of borrowed from the language. We use a lot of sports and war metaphors. So within safety, you wouldn't actually think, well, safety isn't really a war, is it? But actually, once we start talking about lines of defense, we start talking about leadership tours of the front line. These are military metaphors. And what does it do? Because we found out during COVID, actually, the impact of war metaphor. And there's been a lot of study that show that how we think about healthcare and disease, and when we're sick, actually that has a big impact in terms of how we think about things like fighting cancer. So how does the study of metaphor start to shape how we think? And it's not necessarily new. It's been going around for well over 100 years. When Heinrich came up with his domino theory, it was a really nice, simple little metaphor. And people could understand the idea that, an accident was a series of activities and events that were lined up. And if you wanted to actually prevent that accident resulting in the toppling of a domino, you needed to remove one of the dominoes in that chain. And that's kind of continued through. We've got things like bow tie models, a really nice idea that's quite a linear kind of model there. So I don't necessarily think that this is new. I just don't think we've actually stopped and reflected that very often we are talking in metaphors, but more than just this kind of linguistic thing, right? We throw around these metaphors a lot. I don't think we think that they're actually cognitive, and that actually they start to have a real impact. There's a really nice kind of metaphor when it talks about emergency planning, and it talks about them being called fantasy plans. So the moment I say that kind of metaphor that, this emergency plan we've got for this chemical facility or fire is a fantasy plan, I've dismissed it outright. And I've introduced the idea that it's a figure of our imagination. It's something which is invented. But actually, the reality could be slightly different. It could be that actually 80% of what's in this emergency plan is reasonable. It's just that 20% requires a bit of work. But if I set out by calling it a fantasy plan, well, we're gone.